So I wanted to jump on a quick video just to look at a few things that have emerged in the Blazor preview releases. So we're up to preview 5 now of .NET 10. And I've noticed there's an interesting thing where the .NET 8 release was quite seismic because it involved lots of fundamental changes with things like render modes and those kind of things. And added quite a bit of complexity. I think .NET 9 stripped some of that back or tidied up a few loose ends, improved a few long-standing things like the reconnection characteristics for Blazor server. Of course, 10 is another LTS release, and I think looking at it, there's some, again, it's not seismic like 8, but I do think there's some interesting things coming which are useful quality of life improvements and probably worth looking at. So there's a lot of changes, a lot of them are quite small, but there's maybe 3 that I just wanted to look at very quickly in this video. One area is JavaScript interop. JavaScript interop is actually quite kind of battle tested at this point with Blazor, but there's some things that you couldn't do before that you can do now, and a big one is actually to grab hold of a reference to a JavaScript object and then interact with it from your component. And it's probably easier to see this with an example. So if you look at this calculator, for example, what we've got here is a JavaScript class. If you're not familiar with those, but you know C#, you kind of get. You can instantiate one of these through its constructor with this optional parameter here for precision, and then you can perform operations, in this case just the one add operation, get the last operation, that kind of thing. So this is very simple. I didn't spend much time. In fact, ChatGPT put this together. It's just an example. But then if you go to how you might use this, the challenge is what you want to do is load that JavaScript in first of all, and there's various ways of doing that. One of them is to use this module approach here. So we literally use that code to actually import or load the module, the JavaScript module calculator. But then what you want to do in this case is instantiate an instance of that class, the calculator class. And that was harder to do in previous versions, but in the .NET 10 preview releases, it's actually quite straightforward. You can use this invoke new command. But once we have that, and I've assigned it to a field, what we're then able to do is to perform operations on it. So we can, in this case, invoke the add method, for example. So this is the add method here, passing it some parameters, so num1, num2, and that's it. But this is quite handy, because if you think about it, there's often cases where you want to spin something up in JavaScript, but then keep hold of it and interact with its various methods from your C# code. And this makes that a lot easier. And you can see here as well, we've got another example here where we've got a getter that we're invoking. So there's a getter called last operation, this one here, and we can call that, again, from our instance of calculator, as long as we know its name here, and interestingly we're also able here to kind of indicate what we're expecting back from that, which is a string. So all of that to say that once we've got that, we can obviously give this a go, and if we just do it there, that seems to all be working. So that's one improvement, or a couple of improvements, with the ability to invoke constructors and directly access these getters here. So another example is this calculator here. Now this one is, that's kind of similar, but crucially the difference is the user can select which operation they want to perform and then press the button to do it. So if we do an add, it will add. If we do a subtract, it will subtract. Now this one's slightly different. What we actually do here is, again, we load the module, but note how down here, this is the bit that's changed. What we then do is get a reference to the add function and get a reference to the subtract function and store those in this case, variables within our arrays of components. So now we actually have a kind of pointer, I guess, to the add function and to the subtract function. These are JavaScript functions that we can call. So if we just look at how that looks in the JavaScript, it's these down here. So we've got an add function, a subtract function, and then this is the interesting one. This is a dynamic operation which takes in the method, the function, the callback, and then two numbers in this case, and then invokes the callback passing in those two numbers. So you can see where this is going. If we go back to our dynamic calculator, we've got these two functions now. So what we can then do, based on the user's choice here, we can get the relevant function, and then we can invoke the dynamic method here, dynamic operation, with the selected function here. Oh, hello. With the selected function, and we can pass in the two numbers. And that's pretty powerful. There's a few situations in JavaScript where you might want to pass in a callback, and that callback might do different things or be an entirely different function based on conditional logic that you run. So this is a good way of being able to grab references to functions and then pass those functions around when you invoke other functions. So in a way, those are two kind of opposing things, the class that we saw first and then the functions. But both approaches can be quite powerful depending on what it is that you're trying to do. So that's some JavaScript interop improvements that I've picked up on. Then there's one really smallish change, but it is kind of good. I think there's a number of changes around navigation and Navigation Manager, and there's one that's been really annoying if you've ever run into it. So I'll quickly look at these. They're relatively quick things to demo. So if we look at the roots here, what this is it's just pointing to a component. So pages.notfound, that's a component. But this is much cleaner than things you could do before, where you could configure kind of how to handle not found. In this case, it's very simple. If you try and go to a page that doesn't exist, so for example, let's go to does not exist. That's a URL that doesn't exist, /Bob. And then what it's trying to do here, what it is doing is going to this component. And this component is literally a page here, not found. And that's it. So that's kind of useful. And then finally, one which I think is actually quite interesting if you've ever tried to manage or review the performance of your applications, is there are some new metrics for Blazor. Specifically, if we look in here, so I've got .NET Aspire set up for this project, and if we look, what we've been able to add here are some new metrics specifically around Blazor components or Razor components and their life cycle, and also Blazor server circuits. And then there's also this tracing one here that we've also added. So I'll show you these very quickly. If we actually launch this project, rather than launching it directly, if we launch the Aspire project, so in here there is hopefully somewhere an Aspire project, app host 1, beautifully named. So I'm going to run this. So this is running a .NET Aspire project which is configured to run this project. So if you've not seen this, this is essentially a way of it's matured quite nicely now. So it's for just running locally, this is actually very quick to set up. So you can add this .NET Aspire app host, link the project, which in this case is the Blazor project. Also then from your Blazor project, configure these service defaults, which sets up all sorts of things like telemetry and health checks and all this kind of thing, like we just saw here. And then when you run the project, what you actually get now is we get the .NET Aspire dashboard in all its glory. And this is our project running here, our Blazor app project. So if I open that up, this is just going to be the Blazor project that we saw before. So it's got the calculator, dynamic calculator, does not exist page, normal counter, and all this kind of thing. But because I've been interacting with this site now, this Blazor app, we should have some metrics. So where do we see those? Well, we can go to metrics, and then we can select Blazor app. And the interesting ones for us are all of these here at the top, conveniently, which are in the, well, have components in the name. So we've got, for example, event handlers that occurred and how long they took. We've got navigation events, total number of times routes were changed. Perhaps more usefully, we've got rendering information. So this is quite important if you're worried about or concerned about performance. This allows you to see, well, how long did renders take for my components? And it, you know, the way Razor rendering works, where it essentially says, oh, look, here's the thing I rendered last time, you've done something, now that's changed some things, so now I need to compare what I had last time to the changes and create a diff, this DOM diff, that allows me to patch update the DOM with the information or the UI that's now changed as a result of what the user's done. So this just kind of shows us how long that's taking. You can click on one of these to actually see then what it did, and you can see here that we've got a kind of trace of what happens. So this is also useful, which is the other thing to look at here, is we can see lifecycle events in here. So we've got end invoke, you know, this is all quite useful information. And obviously this is in beta form still, but you can begin to see how powerful this could be if you were trying to debug a really problematic component and you just want to see exactly what happened to that component. Then you can enable all these metrics. So I think that's it. And then just for some bonus things, but there's a couple more which are probably worth just quickly calling out. Where are they? So this is a big one, the easily customizable reconnection UI. So when you create a new project now, one thing that becomes immediately apparent is that you can actually see and change the UI for reconnect. So the reconnect modal that you see when Blazor server, this is when something, when a server goes down or you deploy a new version and the circuit connection is, the signal R connection is lost. This shows you kind of what's going on, both in terms of the HTML here. You've also got the CSS, and perhaps more interestingly, you've got the JavaScript here to actually see how this is working, which also, of course, means that you have a lot more flexibility now because you can tweak this and change the behavior of this and the UI depending on what you want it to do. So that's quite a big change. And the other big one, I think, at this point is this one. So if you've ever dealt with pre-rendering for your components, then you'll know there's a situation where you get like a double load, like a flash of content, and you see it on the weather page. Don't know whether it'll be visible here. That's because I was messing around with the navigation manager, but essentially you'll see the page load, and because it's pre-rendered, you'll get some data on the page. Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly then kicks in and it refetches the data and re-renders, and you get a notable flash, especially if that data changes when the data loads again. Now there's a way around that, which is to use this persistent state where you can persist the state from the first render and then load that state in the second render. And the way that works is it kind of embeds the state, depending on whether you're Blazor server or WebAssembly, it's a slightly different mechanism, but it essentially, when it's pre-rendered, takes the state that it's the data that it's used to do that pre-render, serializes it, passes it along to the other renderer, which will be Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly, and then just takes that state and kind of synchronizes it, so it doesn't need to re-render and it doesn't need to fetch more data essentially and do a second fetch. So it's a good efficiency optimization, performance optimization, but there's quite a lot of boilerplate code involved, which the old way involves setting up subscriptions and then interacting with application state and then disposing of all that stuff properly. And essentially the big news for .NET 10 is that they've just completely simplified all that. So there's one attribute that you can use, and that will say that this data here should be persisted between the pre-render and the second render. So that's a lot better. Okay, I think that's kind of it for this quick roundup of some changes that are coming to .NET 10. As ever, Your mileage may vary when it comes to upgrading, but it is an LTS release. It's coming around November. There's probably going to be a go live release, I should imagine, around September is how that usually works. Release candidates are usually released around then. And yeah, let me know what you think of those changes that we've just seen here. Which one or ones are the most interesting to you? If there's any problems that you've been running into that you think this might help you solve. And it will be interesting to see how you get on.